I have the pleasure of introducing Daniel from Flowgear to you. So maybe just a little bit of background why I think this is an awesome breakout session to attend. If you look at the stats that we've provided during the main event, more than 70% of the participants indicated that they've already on a best of breed ERP strategy. And we all know that integration is a nightmare with lots of systems. So Daniel and his team believe they have the answer. The beauty of it is that it's not costing an arm and a leg, and that you can run it yourself. So Daniel, I've set you up to wow the people. Over to you, and thanks, and we are looking forward.
Thanks, Sorrel. You really have set the bar very high there. So thanks very much for putting this together, and it's great to be able to present today. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to pop those into the chat. I'll try and sort of glance across. Otherwise, we can definitely chat at the end of the session as well. So today is just really to give you a bit of an introduction into the Flowgear platform. This is what we're going to cover. We'll probably be about 20, maybe 25 minutes. And as I mentioned, if there's any questions, happy to elaborate in as much detail as you want. So to just backtrack a little bit, I just want to kind of introduce where we come from and the problem that we solve for. You know, if you think back, say 20 years, we've talked about in some of the earlier sessions in Agri, how things used to be done. There was definitely a lot more emphasis on on-premise, and all of the business systems that we were using lived inside our own environment. And so we could have a lot of control over exactly how we moved data around and integrated them. But with the proliferation of cloud, we've lost a lot of that control. And so even in the Agri sector, where a lot of the key systems, notably ERP, is still often on-premise, increasingly we're starting to reach into cloud systems. And, you know, as you saw in the report, many organizations identified as making use of hybrid cloud. And so that presents a problem. We no longer have the ability to forklift data in and out of systems because they're not within our control. We need to engage with the vendor's APIs, but we still have to combine that with integrating into databases and file systems and maybe things like email and FTP as well. And so that's what Flowgear sets out to achieve. It's a single platform that allows you to create integrations and automations across all of the different apps and services inside your own organization, but also importantly with third parties. And I'll touch on a little bit of that third party aspect a little further down the track. Now, it's all very good to invest in a technology platform because of certain features it delivers, but ultimately those features have to give you some kind of business benefit. And if there's kind of one thing that Flowgear does, is it gives you a cost reduction as opposed to manually having to double capture data into different systems and the sort of the margin of error associated with that. So the most obvious thing is that if you can automate a process, then there's no longer a manual component to it. So you're taking out the person who was previously having to do that manually. They're able to move on to a higher level or more productive task, and you get a faster turnaround time. Because those individuals don't have to work on those low-level tasks, as I mentioned, they're able to do things that are much more productive and therefore deliver more value to your business. Now, over time, you may start out your integration strategy just connecting ERP to e-commerce, for example, if you're in retail. But over time, as you're able to connect in more and more systems, you get the benefit of eliminating the data silos that occur. As I mentioned just now, previously, all of our data lived in a single environment, you know, on our own servers, in our own office, or eventually in our own data center. And that's no longer the case. So before we can actually do useful stuff with that data, we have to get it to one place. And an integration platform is a great way to achieve that. And then finally, if you take all of those things in aggregate, what that really translates to is a competitive advantage. If you can streamline your processes, reduce cost, that might translate into reduced cost to your customer. If you can share data effectively and securely with upstream and downstream parties in the supply chain, that itself is a competitive advantage as well. So one of the challenges that we have with our platform is there's not a lot of front end to look at. There's a design area, which I'll show you, but the whole point of integration is it's dealing with integrating or connecting different systems together autonomously. It just happens in the background and things show up where they're meant to be at the right time. So one of the things that I like to do is talk about some of the use cases that we're typically applied to. And the first one is BI. Before you can do BI, and there are many great tools available, you might be using something like Power BI or Click. But before you can do all of that, you actually have to get the data into a place and a structure that is queryable by those tools. So a lot of folks use Flowgear to get data into a data warehouse or a data lake so that they can connect their BI tools on top of that. And what this also means is that if you've currently got flows that ingress data into your ERP, and your ERP is kind of the one place where everything sits, and there's a lot of cost and complexity associated with that, you don't necessarily need that. If the ERP doesn't need to act on certain data sets, you can bypass it completely and have Flowgear act as the single mechanism that gets all of your data to one place so that you can produce reports across multiple systems on top of it. One of the comments, in fact, one of the phrases that Andre used in the presentation earlier was, he kept referring to millennials, and I'm not sure whether I should be offended or feel proud of myself, but I guess I'm an early millennial, and this is probably something that would appeal to me, is the ability to interact with a supplier. So you can also use Flowgear as a kind of back-end enterprise API that you can deliver mobile apps on top of. If you commission someone to build a mobile app for you, they're really good at designing a good user experience. So they'll create a pretty front end and create the features that you need. What's usually tricky for them is to figure out how to integrate into your internal systems, because there could be so many of them. And you could be using SAP or Syspro or Sage or any number of systems. So what Flowgear does is abstracts away the complexity of needing to connect or needing to understand how to connect into a lot of different systems. You can work with the app developer and give them a much simpler interface into your internal systems. And additionally, if you choose to switch out any of those products, maybe it's a CRM, an ERP, or whatever in future, then you're not impacting the mobile app. You can keep it exactly functionally identical to the way it was previously. There was some mention in an earlier talk as well around data sharing with the supply chain. There was talk around things like, establishing provenance and, understanding what chemicals had been used on certain food items and that sort of thing. So one of the use cases for Flowgear is that you can easily build an enterprise API that surfaces information that should be visible to that supply chain. You can control exactly which assets are available and exactly which vendors are that information is available to, and then you can review by virtue of an audit exactly who's accessed what. So if you do need to make certain data available, the platform gives you a way to do that without embarking on a software project. And similarly, if others in the supply chain are publishing data that you need to consume, you can do that as well, again, without having to write any code. Now, depending on where you sit in that supply chain, you might have multiple areas that you operate, and each of them could be using a separate ERP. It might be the same product, but perhaps different databases in disparate locations. So another use case that Flowgear often gets applied to is collecting data from multiple financial systems or ERPs, being able to collate that at head office. And I'll get into how we connect into a lot of different on-premise and locations a little later on, but it gives you one platform that will allow you to manage moving all of that data into one place so that you could report, for example, your financials centrally. And then finally, I think this one's a fairly obvious one. If you have a production facility and you have sensors along the way measuring activity and various other things, you can have that data collected by our platform as well and then ingressed into whatever system you need. It might be the ERP or it might be a more specialized line of business solution. So Flowgear is completely agnostic as to the endpoints. What we give you is a suite of connectors, a visual design area, and you can go and compose those integrations in a way that makes sense for you. Now, one of the questions, if I remember correctly, that came up in the benchmark was this notion of the integration strategy and how formalized that was. So, there were some responses, yes, we have a strategy, but it's not formalized. And yes, we have a strategy, but it is formalized. And I think that was a much lower percentage. And often what happens is if you don't have a formal strategy, what's typically happening is you've got these kind of point-to-point integrations going on. And so I want to just position where you would choose to use a platform as opposed to a hand code solution. I think the first thing to say is that if you genuinely just have 2 or 3 different integration points, you may well be better off just using a hand-coded solution. But as soon as that scales, and it typically does because of the number of systems and the modules that you need to connect across, then you tend to get a lot of overhead on hand-coded solutions. You need to maintain those over time. If the vendor that you're integrating to upgrades their product, they might break their APIs. You have to go back to get the hand-coded integration built. And generally, because these are built as bespoke solutions, they're not really designed with resilience in mind. They might not log as comprehensively as you need. And so generally, you only find out when they broke, you only find that they've broken too late. Some data hasn't shown up, and then you realize that actually it broke a week ago. So moving to a platform will help mitigate those things. If you have business critical operations that depend on integration, then it makes sense to use a platform that will be able to tell you in real time about activity that's taking place, stay up to date with the latest vendors by publishing new connectors and so on. But there's another subtle advantage to a platform. If you go with a hand code solution, it's necessarily, a bunch of code. It gets compiled and deployed into your environment, and it's kind of this black box that sits there, and you trust that your vendor has done what you asked them to do, and things sort of show up in the right place. But you don't really have any way to introspect that. If you move over to a visual design paradigm, which is what we do in Flowgear, then even if you're not comfortable making changes to the design of the integration, you can still go in and look over the workflow designs. You can see the history of the activity in an immense amount of detail, and that gives you a real sense of agency over the solution, and it gives you the confidence to evolve those integrations over time as well. And finally, these factors combined, the fact that you can design visually, you can iterate very quickly, means that you can get to market faster. So if you've just dropped in a CRM solution, instead of it being a multi-month long project to build the integrations to support that, you can build them in a matter of weeks, sort of worst case scenario. So your speed to be able to adopt systems is much higher. Now, practically, the category that we're known as is Ipas. This is a Gartner term. It just stands for Integration Platform as a Service. And these tools typically deal with connecting to structured data sources, so primarily APIs, but also databases and file systems. And in most Ipas platforms, there's an emphasis on visual design as opposed to a code design. More recently, there's a new kid on the block. I actually saw this term pop up in the slide from the previous breakout sesh. And it's called RPA, Robotic Process Automation. What this seeks to do is engage with a product just like a human user would. So instead of connecting to the back-end API, it acts as a robot that can log in through the front end of an application and then simulate a user by clicking on an appropriate item in a menu, filling in a text box, clicking a button, etc. And the advantage of using an RPA tool is that you don't need the technical knowledge to be able to integrate with the back end of a product. Where we think it's an appropriate use is where there is no API available. And the reason is that RPA approaches tend to be brittle. A vendor is more likely to change the look and feel of their user interface, where they're not expected to have to keep compatibility, than they are on the API, which they know they have to keep compatibility. So we think the best of both worlds is literally the best of both worlds, to blend the two together. Use Ipas when it makes sense. But if you have legacy systems, on-prem systems, systems that do not have APIs or databases that are available to you, then you can complement that with the RPA capability that we have in our platform to be able to augment those data sources as well. Now, it's important to understand where we fit in. So we have this slide, we call it the Continuum, and it's really just an acknowledgement that there's a spectrum of products out there and they're intended for different customer demographics. So on the far left, you've got the citizen integrator platforms, tools like Zapier and IFT, and then on the far right, you've got the traditional tools, the enterprise service bus. And then in reality, you've also got most other Ipas platforms. The truth is that most of them have gone after much larger enterprise and they have a price tag to match. This is kind of a high level of how Flowgear breaks down from a feature perspective. What we're seeking to do is give you the ease of use that you'll see on the citizen integrator platforms, but at the same time match that with a level of sophistication and complexity of solution that you might need to be able to build that you'll see in some of the higher end products. And so Flowgear is suited to the SMB up to a smaller enterprise market typically. Just to contextualize where we fit into that enterprise market, these are some of the other vendors. You may have heard of some of these names. This is information that we've just screen grabbed off Gartner Peer Insights. And there's actually quite a number of reviews against certainly all of these vendors. But this particular tool does give some useful comparisons. So I think there are probably like somewhere between 30 and 50 points that individuals providing these reviews can comment against. So do go and have a look at us and see how we score and rank in different respects. So our value proposition in summary then really centers around these three pillars. The first one is that we give you a platform that offers a very high ease of use We do that by allowing you to design integrations visually. Because they're visual and you've got a single place to work and test out those integrations, you can iterate very quickly. And as I spoke about earlier, that gives you an agency over the solution that you don't have with a kind of black boxed or hand-coded solution. At the same time, you can build sophisticated solutions. So this is not a Zapier where you can look at one trigger and kind of take one action with some basic data mapping. It goes much deeper than that, and I'll show you some of that in a sec. And at the same time, acknowledge that a lot of businesses still need to reach into on-premise. So we have a strong mechanism for allowing you to reach into any on-premise data points as well. And then finally, from a commercial point of view, we have a unique model as compared with the other Ipas vendors, where instead of pricing based on the specific connectors that you need or the number of CPU cores that you want to run a license for, we look at the number of active workflows. And that is to say that on all of our plans, you're able to build any number of workflows or integrations. And what you're metered on and what your subscription encapsulates is the subset of those that are going to be active at a particular point in time. So that means that you can jump in at a very low price point on our base plan, and that will get you 10 active workflows. You might then start to build out other scenarios, you explore them, you R&D them, and those that you deem viable for production, you'll then need to bring into the active workflow suite, and that is the point at which you might consider moving up to a different plan, but not before. So there's no subscription that you need to take to get a particular connector license, just to be able to experiment, and you're able to completely prove the value of an integration before there is any change in the subscription that you would need to be running it on top of. A good part of the value is the connectors that we have available in the platform. There are about 200 today. We segment them into two camps. The first is what we call product connectors. You can see a chunk of them on the screen here. So these deal with specialized connectors for different ERPs, HR systems, CRMs, e-commerce platforms, and so on. And then the other approximately 100 deal more with open standards and services, so generic access to databases, file systems, email, generic API access, and so on. And in addition, if you've got something that's truly bespoke, you can build your own connectors as well, or you can commission our team to get those built out for you. From a delivery perspective, what makes us quite unique is we're the only vendor in our category to give you in-region hosting in our public cloud, which we run on top of Microsoft Azure. That would be the Terrico Isando data center up in Johannesburg greater area. And what that means is that from a data perspective, although we're not actually storing data, we obviously have to process it, but it does mean that it doesn't even leave the borders of South Africa. So very useful from a South African and African context. We do have some flexibility around this. I'll be happy to unpack this if there's any interest around it. But we can give you either a public cloud or we can give you a dedicated private cloud running under your own Azure subscription. And all of those components, all of those models give you a hot disaster recovery as well with an uptime guarantee around it. I mentioned earlier how important it is to be able to connect into cloud and on-premise, and actually this was something that was a key capability for us back when we launched in 2010. So we have a software agent that does this for us. We call it a drop point, and that drop point is a service that installs into your environment. We give you a huge amount of control at the drop point that allows you to determine exactly what services it's allowed to access in your drop point in your environment. Again, I'd be happy to elaborate on that. But what it is then is a single agent that allows you to connect into anything that lives inside your on-premise network, provided you've given permission to it. It creates an encrypted persistent transport into our cloud environment, so your data is never unsecured as it travels over the internet, and then it can deal with broken connectivity. A lot of production facilities may be out in remote areas, maybe with not the best connectivity, so the mechanisms that we built help you deal with a whole class of failures due to a connectivity failing. The workflows are just able to pause until the connection comes back online, and then they'll restream any data that wasn't acknowledged due to the outage. Finally, I touched on this a little bit earlier, and I'll show you in a second as well. But this is an example of what the Datamapper looks like. There's a few things that are notable here. What we have is some source data represented on the left-hand side. So it's a tree of an invoice object, and kind of in that third pillar is the target schema or the target tree that we want to send the data, we want to reshape it into. And the lines, as I'm sure you can infer, are allowing you to visually map that data across. But on the far right, what we also have is a function language. And you may recognize some of these functions because they're almost identical to Excel. So the learning curve that you need to be able to do these types of mappings is really drastically reduced. If you've worked with Excel, I think Andre mentioned earlier that in Agri Excel the whole way. So if you've got familiarity with that, it's very easy to get up and running with this. But there's a more subtle advantage, is that if you decide to change out some of the business systems, really what you're doing is you don't have to rewrite the entire workflow. You replace one side and you update your map visually, as you can see on screen here. So with that, I'm just going to jump straight into the platform. I'm just going to point out one or two things. We're nearly at our time limit, so I'll be very brief on that. And we'll get an example integration from Arch Retail to point of sale across into SysPro, where we'll integrate an invoice. So before I go into one I made earlier, let's just open up the design canvas. So this is what the visual design area looks like. And if, for example, I want to do an integration into SysPro, here's how I begin. So click on the plus button on the canvas over here. This comes up with a list of the different connectors that are available. And I can choose the SysPro connector, and then you'll notice that I have places that I can provide payloads. So for example, here in this data property, that's where I need to send in the order or the invoice that I want to generate. And one of the things that we do in our platform is make available all of the different types of interactions that the connector supports. And I access that by going to this choose sample area over here. And I'm just going to pull up the sales order import sample. So this one over here. And as I select that, it goes and puts specimen data onto the design canvas for me. And I can drill into it. Over here, I see an example of an XML structure for how a SysPro order needs to be presented. And then over on the right-hand side is a tree view. And SysPro are really great with their schemas. So if I hover one of these, I can see all that help text popping up that tells me exactly how that field functions. So it's very easy to discover the fields that are available. And as you can imagine, most integrations then are a process of figuring out how to query data from a source, then run it through a map, and then ingest it into the destination system. So here's the one I made earlier. What this does is just queries a point of sale database, literally just connecting into a SQL database. So we're querying a couple of different tables. We have sales orders, and then we have detail lines against those orders. So the first step over here is querying those orders. Then we're querying the lines against the orders. Then we're meshing them into one. And this is where it starts to get a bit more interesting, because the next step is to take that incoming data and remap it into the shape that we need for the target system. So I'll drill into the mapping, just show you what that looks like. This is like that screen grab in the presentation I just showed you. And you can see it's giving me an example of some of the data that's sitting in those particular fields. It's showing me the tree over here. I can kind of drag and drop these different mappings, and then you can see some expressions happening here. And it works, as I said, very similarly to Excel. So if I start typing a function name, it'll give me all of the parameters around that, and it'll kind of coach me through it. And in real time, it's giving me an update on what that data now looks like. So on the right-hand side here, that's my output, and that's showing me how that data has been transformed. You can do a number of things here. So you can do cross-hierarchical mappings. You can also do correlations. So you might notice here that we've got a function called lookup. That's like an Excel VLOOKUP. So for example, if we need to integrate a stock code from point of sale into SysPro and they happen to have different SKUs, I need to correlate that, stock code 123 becomes ABC in the target, and I can do that with a lookup all in line using this quick map tool. In addition to that, I can do things like filtering, so I can include and exclude data based on certain criteria, and I can even do aggregations. That's what these key icons here are for. So for instance, if I had an order that had the same stock code repeated across multiple lines, I could use aggregation to collapse those down to individual lines and then sum together the quantities. So once we've done that, then the next step that we're going to take is we're going to iterate through those orders one by one. That's this for each stage over here. And then finally, we're going to create the order inside SysPro. This is the connector that I showed you earlier where we loaded a sample in. The final step is that we want to look at whether that order got created successfully. So what we're doing here is we're looking at a particular field in the output. We're looking for the presence of the sales order field that indicates it generated successfully. And then we're logging success or failure if there was an error, and our alerting and so on would trigger on the back of that. So let's just give that a quick run. And you can see here, as I started executing it, it popped out with the activity log. This is obviously what I'm seeing from a design experience perspective. Once these are running in production, they run on a scheduler, or they can be triggered by an API. Users don't necessarily come in to interact, but you can see how tactile this is. I can make some changes, hit the button, and within a second, the workflow is running, and I'm starting to see that feedback. So if I focus some of the properties in the log here, I can have a look, for example, at the order headers, and I can drill into the data that came back. There's the order header information. What's underlying that is this document over here, and I can, inspect it and check it's behaving as I need to. If I go a little further down, I can see the syspro call. So there's the first order being created towards the bottom over there. And if I drill into the order data, this is the document that it generated for us. And then I can have a look at the response that came out of syspro. So here, showing me that it processed one item and none of them were invalid. In other words, it proceeded successfully. And as I step through the activity log, I can see then it did an evaluation. Was the order created successfully? Yes, it was. And then we log what we call a success key value, and that is then the basis of the reporting and the dashboard system that we have built into the platform. And just on that note, I'll go across into that dashboard, and we can have a quick look at it. So along the top here are some just high-level metrics about the use of the account that I'm in. And then down here is just a simple pie chart showing me the success and failures. And I'd be able to drill into those, pull a report, or I could indeed automate that and have those sent to a user. So that's just a high-level overview of the platform. Now let's talk a little bit about how you actually go about implementing this. So Grovation is one of our certified channel partners, and that's why we're proud to be able to present with them today. What that means is that their technical team have been through an in-depth certification course. They've actually already delivered a number of solutions on top of the Flowgear platform. And so there are two approaches that you can use. You're welcome to self-serve on Flowgear. You can sign up for a trial account, you can start building stuff, and we'll help you out with a proof of concept in that scenario if you want that as well. But if you want to be able to lean on an industry expert, you can also work directly with Grovation. They'll be able to help you with a turnkey solution. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'll hang around for a bit. If there are any questions, happy to respond to them. But really, there's kind of two actions that you might want to consider taking here. If you know what you're looking for, you kind of have a strategy and you're looking for the products that are going to help fit into that strategy, and an integration platform is one of them, then feel free to reach out to us. We will assist you with a proof of concept. What we do under that is take you through, we take your requirements, we look at 2 different systems that you need to integrate and 1 or 2 modules across them. And we actually, on a completely on-risk basis, so no cost to you, we go and bake out a simplified version of that integration using your test systems. So you're actually seeing your test data show up in that integration. And then we'll go present that back to you, and you can do an evaluation from there. Otherwise, if you're really just at kind of an earlier stage, reach out to us at this link over here, and we'll help you out with an integration readiness assessment, where we'll walk you through a number of questions and we help you assess what steps might be most appropriate. Everything from procurement, looking at the different solutions that you might need to consider investing in, to the specific complete solutions, perhaps the integrations that would best service your business. So if there's any questions, I'll hang around here a little bit. Let's see if we've got anything in the chat. So feel free to unmute and call it out, or send me a message over the chat.
Daniel, Paul here. Not actually a question, just big congratulations on your presentation. It was excellent and very informative. So thank you very much for your time.
Great, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Quite hard to digest, but yeah, I will definitely follow up more on the solution and the platform. But yeah, once again, really well done. Very nice.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that's it then. So as I say, feel free to reach out to us via the contact link over there. Anthony is also currently on our booth in the exhibition hall, so feel free to reach out to us, jump into a chat there if you want to have any sort of one-on-one discussion. So with that, thank you, and Sorrel, appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for everybody who joined. And please if you have any questions, Daniel and his team, there's not a lot of IT companies or IT solution providers that's as helpful as they are. So when he say he will do something at his cost, he's not joking. So take him up on it. And I must say we are using Flowgear. That's why we became a partner. We started using it to just move some of our data between our systems and especially into our BI side. And oh man, it's really easy to actually maintain. I think the one thing, Daniel, that really is a big plus for me is the fact that we can monitor all of our integrations with the dashboard and see when they fail, so we don't have to wait until our people are yelling at us. We can fix the problem before they even know it exists. So yeah, please make contact. And Daniel, thanks for your time and thanks for the good presentation.
Great, thank you. Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.